Welcome back. We're about to begin our afternoon panel on journalism in and about the Midwest. And so at this point, I'd like to hand it over to our chair, Brian Bowe.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. As he just said, my name is Brian J. Bowe. I'm an assistant professor at Western Washington University, but I'm particularly proud to be here because I'm a really proud Grand Valley alum. I'm a product of this place. I bleed Laker blue, so it's a real pleasure for me to be here. And I'd like to introduce our panelists, but before I do that, I am a music journalist by background, and just this week, actually just yesterday, I was writing a story about a guy named Pokey LaFarge, who's wonderful. You should check out his stuff. And he's kind of this traditional musician, and he plays stuff that he says is very emblematic of the Midwest. And as we were talking about his new record, he said, to a certain extent, you have to do things bigger and better in the Midwest to be acknowledged. And I think that speaks to sort of the central thesis of this panel. And that is this idea that there is some sort of fight for space on the national media agenda that folks in the Midwest have to undergo. So we're gonna interrogate that question, pull it apart, maybe agree with it, disagree with it a little bit. So as we get started, I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my left, your right, we have Ben Kessling, who is a U.S. news reporter at the Wall Street Journal in the Chicago bureau. Before joining the Wall Street Journal, he was in the Marine Corps as an infantry officer. He graduated from Wabash College and has a Master of Divinity degree from the Harvard Divinity School. And he also attended the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. We also have Jennifer Day, who's the editor of Printers Row Journal, which is the Chicago Tribune's premium book section. She's been at the Tribune, or contributing to the Tribune, regularly since 2008. She started at the Toledo Blade. She's also an alumna of the Hauenstein Center for Politics and Journalism. And during her time at that center, she worked as a reporter for the Houston Chronicle in the Washington Bureau. And then finally, we have Monica Davey, who's the Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times. She's been at the Times for the past 10 years and has covered lots of stuff related to the Midwest. In fact, the Midwest is really what she does. And some of the big stories that she's been on in recent years include efforts to limit labor unions in Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan, struggle over abortion rights in Kansas, all manner of political corruption in Illinois. Business has been good. Before she joined the Times, she was at the Chicago Tribune, the St. Petersburg Times, the Roanoke Times, and the City News Bureau of Chicago, and she has a bachelor's degree in linguistics from Brown. So what an esteemed panel we have here. And I guess a good way to start might be just to restate the central question here and let you guys have at it. The Midwest is often referred to pejoratively as flyover country, and in your experience, is this considered by your national desk editors to be flyover country that we sort of don't care about? And I guess, why don't we start with you, Ben?
Well, I mean, it's good to be here. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it. I mean, I'm out of the Chicago bureau, you know, and Monica's out of the Chicago bureau, so that is, you could say that's right in the middle of, what would pejoratively be called flyover country. I don't think that we have that big of a struggle to cover the Midwest. I think the Midwest is an inherently interesting place where, and a lot of coverage comes out of. I mean, think about the national political coverage that's happening right now. Questions with pension issues in a lot of the cities in the area. Granted, some of the larger, maybe some of the larger economic questions are going to have a DC or a New York focus. Entertainment questions or high-tech startups will always be framed on with the coast. Politics is always going to have a DC focus, national politics. But I think that there's a lot of news coming out of the Midwest, and I think that we do a good job paying attention to it and don't have to worry about struggling to get it in.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, obviously, I've actually covered the Midwest for 12 years for the New York Times, and I cover 11 states in the Midwest and have been to all of them many times. And so, of course, I'm very biased in saying that I think I love Midwestern coverage. I find it the most interesting thing there could possibly be, and I don't find it to be flyover country at all. And I would note that our bureau has actually grown significantly, and we've opened a bureau in Kansas City as well. So I think, I'm not saying this is true for all regional papers, but I think as a national paper, we actually cover it more than ever before. We've brought in a video journalist to Chicago. So I find it to be a region that is fascinating and probably could get more. I'd love to see more and more and more coverage, but I think that my editors in New York are as fascinated by the place as I am.
Yeah, and obviously I'm based at the Chicago Tribune, so this isn't quite an appropriate question for me to answer, but just speaking as somebody based in the Midwest and from the Midwest, I think it'd be interesting if, as Midwesterners, we were able to refocus the conversation a little bit about ourselves rather than ourselves in relation to the coast or in relation to Washington or these other places.
Wow, that's fascinating. Can I ask you to sort of follow up on that? How might we reframe that question?
Well, I'm not sure that it's so much about how we do it as just to do it. I don't think that we necessarily need to talk about ourselves in terms of flyover country. I mean, we see that we're being covered by the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and to some extent, that's great. But also, how are we covering ourselves, and how are we reflecting on our own culture?
Great. The next question that came to mind for me is, in my mind, when I think of the Midwest, there's really two Midwests. There's the urban industrial Midwest, and then there's the rural agricultural Midwest. And on some levels, they seem like very different places. And I don't know, A, if you think that that's true, but B, does that difference in interests and issues, does that make this a particularly challenging, interesting, exciting, infuriating place to cover?
I think that's all true. Exciting and infuriating. I think the truth is, I think it's not. That may be one of the reasons people have a sense that the Midwest isn't covered as much. That when you think of the South, there's a certain character to it, and you see stories, they sort of bring that character to it. The same with the coasts. I feel like there's almost a stereotype of what people in California are like and what those stories will be about. In the Midwest, it is a big mix. I would argue it's more than just two groups, rural and urban. There's, suburban, there's, the Hmong community, there's Native American community, there are Scandinavian communities. There's so many different communities to cover. So I think what it comes down to is accepting the fact that it's not monolithic. You can't necessarily write about the heartland as all one thing, and nor would you want to. But you can tell it in all that complication that it has. And I think it makes it that much more interesting, the idea that you can have a Detroit in the same region, that you can have, long stretches of empty land in South Dakota, makes it all the more interesting. It's a real range of people. It's not a monolithic group of Midwesterners. I think it's a real mix.
And if you're looking at me, if you want to use that sort of binary mix, the Midwest is a great spot where those two things connect, right? Like look at if you're talking about GMOs in a big company listed on New York Stock Exchange, maybe based somewhere, wants to do something with GMOs, eliminate GMOs, or talk about GMOs. Well, a lot of that stuff's being grown and developed in the Midwest, or how oil's shipped and changes in what's going on with rail shipping of oil or commodities. I feel like that binary is a false dichotomy, right? But if you want to look at it that way, you can really say, well, this is where those things intersect. So you can talk about those. You can talk about the farmer who's growing those crops, and also the rail terminus where those end and where they go on to be shipped. Or I think that's a really useful way to look at things as well.
Honestly, I've been thinking a lot about the whole concept of regional identity lately. And to some extent, I wonder how much the rise of digital culture and globalization has just changed it altogether for all regions, not just the Midwest. Different populations move in and move out, and cultures change and shift. So is it really true that Chicago is the land of deep dish pizza? And I mean, my husband actually is from Rhode Island, and we go back there and he gets infuriated every time he sees clam shacks that advertise chowder with an A instead of chowder, because it's sort of this cartoonish version of a cultural identity that once existed and has shifted to the point that people are aware of it in a way that sort of diminishes it to an extent, or I'm not quite sure. But anyway, that's sort of my half-formed thought.
Yeah. Well, no, that makes me think of, last semester I was teaching a course on broadcast, the history of broadcast media, particularly in the US. And one of the things that was really interesting is we think about 1950s sitcom culture that we do see in these kind of historical artifacts. And the minute you start to poke at it, you realize that this 1950s sitcom America never existed. And as we talk about the Midwest, and as I look at some of the books out there, a lot of them resonate with me as a Midwesterner, but at the same time, I wonder if this is some sort of a mirage of cultural memory, rather than, is the Midwest that we keep talking about and that keeps being referenced culturally, is it something that ever actually existed, or is it something that we're kind of collectively misremembering or idealizing?
Or even in a way, another interesting take on that is that we're continually inventing, reestablishing what the Midwest is. Last week I was in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities, covering some of what's happening with the Somali community, and talking with members of the Somali community, asking why Minneapolis? What is it about this place that draws you? And it kept coming up that it's the Midwest. It's very welcoming, and there was a lot. And this is first generation immigrants who see the Midwest as this identity that they want to be a part of. And so I think that it's not necessarily always a hearkening back to way things were, or it's almost projecting the idealism forward in a way.
I also think there is some shred of it that's true. As with most stereotypes of anyone, there is a shred of it. I mean, again, you wouldn't want to say that everyone's nice in Minnesota, but if you compare communities that will remain nameless on the East Coast to those, you go to Minnesota, you're going to actually have a different experience on the street. You're going to have a different experience as a reporter. There are moments where I think to myself, yeah, that's very Midwestern. There is also something to the idea of stoicism, which again is sort of a stereotype. On the other hand, there are some moments where there are conflicts or issues in the Midwest. You see a giant tornado hit Joplin, or you see drought come through Nebraska, and you watch every time. There is a certain stoicism. You wouldn't want to take that to the extreme, and you might not even want to write it that way because it's so predictable, but there is something in the way people come across that is uniquely Midwestern. I would argue there is something a little uniquely Midwestern, especially if you go and compare it to sort of more extreme other communities where you just don't find that. Do you guys disagree?
No, I'm chuckling because I have an image of my head of a city that I think you might be talking about.
And I say that as I grew up in Chicago. I grew up in the Midwest. I've lived in a bunch of different places, and it does feel different to me. I recognize it as home in a way. I recognize the way people talk about things. It resonates more with me than some people in other communities do. It's just the nature of being from somewhere.
So can I ask you, do you think you cover the Midwest differently as a Midwesterner than somebody from the outside would?
I think I do. I try to make sure not to be too loving, and to be objective, and to look at it, not to make everything precious, and to just do the job of reporting, which you'd have to do anywhere. But I do think that when there are those moments where I'm interviewing somebody and I have a moment of recognition where I can sort of see my grandparents in them, or I can sort of see a streak of something that feels familiar to me. Yes, I do have a flash of recognition. In the same way, that's not to say, so I worked in Roanoke, Virginia, and covered a very rural community, and it was a very southern community, and I found that equally fascinating. I just didn't recognize things in the same way. I didn't sort of get it in the same way. And so I think I probably do cover it differently. I hope I don't treat it sort of sentimentally. But there are those moments in the reporting itself where I see something I kind of recognize or that feels really familiar and I get in a way that I didn't necessarily when I was covering the South, or I used to work in Florida, and I really didn't have that same recognition in some moments.
Does that recognition inform any special way of interrogating the culture of the Midwest?
What do you mean?
I was born in Dayton and from Kentucky, and if I'm covering something from those areas, there's a familiarity, but there's also, you recognize the things that you grew up with that you may take issue with, or say, well, here's some questions that really need to be asked of this community.
I think that's true. I think that's healthy, right? Kind of know what's happening. So, I grew up in Chicago, so writing about politics in Chicago feels, I can recognize some of the pitfalls and traps that happen to people there in politics. I'm not sure that any of that's a bad thing. I always love it, though, when people say to me, "You're from the New York Times, so when did you get here?" And,
right.
and I'm like, they hear the accent and suddenly realize that possibly I might actually be from down the street. But.
Great. So kind of building on this, I thought of this question really originally for Jennifer, but I think we can open it up to everybody. And I guess I'll start by saying I think one of the reasons that there might be this perception that the Midwest is undercovered or underloved on a national level is because in the presidential scrum, the Midwest really doesn't seem to play as much of at least a rhetorical big deal, aside from Iowa.
Oh, I disagree.
You disagree?
Completely.
Okay.
Number one, Iowa. Look at where
sure.
reporters are spending all their time in Iowa right now. In fact, that New Hampshire gets short shrift to Iowa, I would argue. And you look at the states that actually are battlegrounds, they remain, Wisconsin, Michigan.
Sure.
The battlegrounds are still big and out here. So I think they do get attention. I think it may not be, I just don't agree, I guess.
Okay. So setting that aside, I used to work at a newspaper in New Hampshire, so I'm probably hypersensitive to New Hampshire news. So that's a good mirror you held up to me. My bigger point, though, is I wonder if the Midwest is more important as this kind of cultural idea than it is as a political reality. But I think.
I think as a political reality, I'm sorry to be bossy here.
No, please do. I love it.
I just think, again, you look at just literally the swing states and the battlegrounds, and a lot of them are, I'm not saying all of them are, there certainly are interesting places in other regions where presidential candidates are really trying to make their cases. But I would argue that if you look at the upper Midwest in particular, There's been a remarkable political transformation over the last several years, and these are the states that are really in play. Since 2010, a pretty blue area turned entirely red at the state level, and the presidential candidates are looking around to say, how do we get some of that? Because in Wisconsin, Barack Obama is still winning, but Republicans run the place. So
Right.
I actually would argue that the Midwest is really a focus of certainly the presidential attention, and also the state politics are really important in that Washington isn't getting anything done. They're all tied up in fighting. But in these states where single party control has happened out here, and that includes Minnesota, where the Democrats took over and then lost control in 2014. But this is where all sorts of policies are actually getting tested, because the Wisconsins, the Michigans, the Indianas, they've actually been able to pass legislation in a way that you don't see happening in Washington. So all sorts of really fascinating policies are getting tested, and in Minnesota on the other side of that equation. And I think that's something that national media has increasingly noticed and focused on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as an incubator for some of these bigger issues that are going to come up and have been coming up for presidential elections have come up in midterms. I mean, look at Iowa's midterm races. Those were, those got a substantial amount of national attention, and even some of the things happening at the like Illinois governor race, all of these, and as there may be switches happening at the state level, or as states turn from one color to the other, then you're able to have some of those policies actually be pushed through, right? Like that's what's kind of allowing some of this testing. I mean, is that what?
Well, I wanted to switch and give a little bit of time to hear from each of you. Beforehand, we were talking about some of the important stories or important issues you have covered. And Ben, you spent a lot of time in Ferguson as that was all unfolding, and I wanted to offer you the chance to reflect a little bit on that and tell us what that was like, and as these similar kinds of stories continue to unfold. Just today we have charges in the Baltimore case against 6 police officers, and this seems to be a story that's really bubbling up nationally, but that has its roots in Ferguson here in the Midwest, and in some ways seems to be a contemporary kind of rehash, or it's a horrible. It's the reboot of something that happened 40-some years ago, also in the Midwest. So can you talk a little bit about your experience covering that story?
Well, I mean, one thing that is really interesting, I haven't been able to really put my finger on, is whether or not that's a story that what happened in Ferguson, if it had to happen in a place with that, in the Midwest, with that particular socioeconomic, demographic, and even geographic mix, if that was necessary. I mean, if we would have the things that are happening in South Carolina or Baltimore that are in the news now, I'm trying to figure out if those would have been able to catalyze a movement in the same way that what happened in a particular time and place in Ferguson were able to sort of unlock. And I think a lot of that goes back to the identity of the sort of geographic and cultural identity of that place and where it is. I mean, St. Louis is, is St. Louis a southern town? Is it a Midwestern town? Is it a northern town? Is the way that things has transformed there over the years, is that a unique thing to the way that immigration patterns have taken place in the Midwest? And I think that's an interesting question. I'd love to hear what people's thoughts are on that?
So I think similarly, Monica, for you, and you alluded to this as you were talking a minute ago, this whole question of what's happened in the labor, in organized labor in the Midwest, has over the last few years has been really remarkable, and you've been really in the thick of that issue. So do you have a sense, well, first of all, if you can talk about what it was like to cover that story, but also if you, I don't know if you've figured out what's going on yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's a little like the Ferguson situation in that it's still happening, and I think we're still all figuring out what is this going to add up to. I mean, with Ferguson, it feels to me as though we are in a really big moment of change on this, and it'll be really fascinating to watch now as this goes on. It's clearly going to go on, and the question becomes what changes come out of it. You know, how big, how much are we going to remember this as a moment where everything changed? I'm really fascinated to see that. I think that the labor issue, the truth is I was in Michigan working on a story when Governor Walker announced Act 10 in Wisconsin, which was to limit collective bargaining for public sector workers back in 2011, early 2011. He had just taken office, and I believe I had to drop whatever story I was on and fly to Madison, Wisconsin from here. I think I was even in the western part of Michigan at the time, and was very grumpy to give up a story for what maybe was going to be a few people marching around at the Capitol, but that turned out, of course, to be, you know, more than a few people marching around in a much bigger story. And we spent weeks and weeks there, and it's been fascinating what's happened with that, and fascinating to watch the recalls. And I mean, I think clearly when you look at Wisconsin and then Indiana and then Michigan, the labor, there have been lots of what people in labor see as attacks on labor, and there's been the diminishment of the power of labor, and there are pushes on to continue that. I mean, Wisconsin just passed right to work less than a month or so ago, and it's really interesting. I think the pieces of it that I'll be fascinated to see are whether what we see in terms of union membership in 10 years, where are we on that? What is the role of labor at that point? Will there still be a strong political role for labor? I mean, again, it's one of these sort of pivot points where you think this is something big is changing, and how it comes out, it's sort of hard to know at this point. But yeah, it was a really fascinating story to watch, and especially, I think, the fact that it was taking place in the upper Midwest, which has been such a home to labor over so many years, that felt different. And Wisconsin, in particular, you know, is a place where covering the legislature before 2010 and covering it now feels extremely different. When they talk about Minnesota nice or Wisconsin nice or any kind of Midwestern nice, that legislature had at some moments been rightly characterized as very polite. There was a lot of bipartisanship. People would go out drinking after they argued with each other on the floor. They would still go out to the bar in the Capitol Square and hang out together. And there's a lot of anger up there now, and it really feels different. So it's always fascinating to me to watch, like, how is the story going to end? And they're sort of leading the way on this question about labor nationally, I think. I mean, I think you look at it in the rest of the country, and people are watching for what's happening here.
Okay. So as we keep noting, Jennifer, you're in sort of a different part of the news product. And so for you, my question is probably a little bit different, and that is, what's good art and literature tend to happen or can happen as a result of troubled times. And I think the Midwest, certainly since 2008, and in Michigan since before that, it's definitely been troubled times. Are there any big sort of book trends that are very Midwestern-centric that you're seeing? Is there anything particularly that's exciting happening on your beat that you think relates to these issues that we've been talking about?
Sure. I think that literature, the whole point of literature is to try to make sense of life and what's going on around you. And so, yes, there's definitely a lot of interesting stuff coming out of the Midwest. Probably the book that has been the most influential and potentially had the largest impact on a national scale with a very Midwestern core focus was Thomas Dyge's Third Coast a couple years ago. It's a cultural history of Chicago, but it also told sort of the broader story of how Chicago redefined the Midwest and America in the process. I think we've seen a lot of stuff suddenly come out of the Ozarks. I think that's partly because of Daniel Woodrell and partly because publicists love when they can pitch something as the next whatever. So,
Sure.
so there's been some out of Missouri and the Ozarks. But I honestly think that I know somebody was asking me whether it's felt like Midwestern writers had a more difficult time making it in the publishing industry, and I don't actually think that that's true. I think that great writing rises up. I think it's a very big, vast ocean of pitches that go out into the publishing industry. And I think it's actually harder to find great works than you might think. So I don't think that the gatekeepers care where it comes from if it's good. If it just, rises.
Sure.
So.
I guess I'll open that up. Have you guys read any good Midwest books lately? That's a...
Uh-oh. Trying to think of Midwestern. I'm not sure I have.
Yeah, I don't...
Well, and also, what do you mean by Midwestern
Well, right.
too? That's
right, because
always an
is
interesting
it an author who comes from the Midwest, or is it a
Right.
topic that relates to the Midwest?
Right.
Because those are different
I
things.
mean, something like the Third Coast is very identifiable, but what about somebody like George Saunders or even, David Foster Wallace? Both grew up in Illinois, but are they Midwestern writers? And I mean, Syracuse could claim them too. I mean,
Sure.
it's an interesting question.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that's clear that's happening up here is we're very much just having a conversation, and so I want to throw out there that in my role as moderator here, if those of you out there in the audience have questions you'd like to throw on the floor, in fact, okay.
I get a question, or maybe a comment for Monica, by the way. We always like reading your stuff. She comes to South Dakota a lot, covers South Dakota stories. But one thing that I noticed is that, or one of your colleagues commented to me that they had one person, one New York Times reporter, and this was a couple years ago, and maybe things have changed, but they had one person to cover the states of Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Iowa. And that doesn't seem like enough to me. There's a lot more stories out there to be covered.
So I'm going to give you the phone number for my editor in New York, and you can. Now, the truth about that is too much to cover, right? However, you should think about where it's come from and where it's gotten to. So the truth is that when I started in the Chicago Bureau 12 years ago, we had 2 people in Chicago and no one in Kansas City. We covered the 11 states with 2 people, 11 states with 2 people out of Chicago flying around, and that was it. We now have a bureau in Kansas City with a person. We have 3 people in Chicago. We have a video journalist in Chicago. We've expanded, actually. I mean, we'd love to have more, but I feel like we are actually doing sort of more rigorous coverage and more extensive coverage than ever in the Midwest. And I've sort of watched the change. So we'd always love to have more. The truth is that what we're covering, we've changed a little bit in how we cover it. It used to be the New York Times was going in to write a story about South Dakota for a couple weeks. We'd work on writing a really special story that was different from everybody else's, that somebody would never have seen in the local paper there. Now we do a little more. I mean, we went to Ferguson and spent, months there. So we're doing, I would say, more coverage and a different kind of coverage as the industry changes. Everyone is. And I think we're all finding our way with that. But Is that too many states to cover? Yes. Do we always have, I mean, our biggest problem is that there are always more stories that we would like to write, all of us. There has never been a day where somebody came into the office and said, I can't think of anything to write about today. It's always turning down stories and having to say, I really want to cover that, but I have something that I think is even better, riper and better. And we've always, all of us always have like 10 stories on our lists of things that we want to do. So the good news is there's a lot to cover. Would we want more people? Yes. But we've actually expanded dramatically, I would argue, John, over the last 10 years. And I like seeing that. I think that's fantastic. I think the Midwest is getting more deeper coverage, at least from us.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Do you think that there's ever a danger of identifying or chasing kind of quirky or oddball stories? Because I can remember one national reporter came to South Dakota, spent a lot of time, it was great, and I thought this person was going to do a really interesting story on something, and they ended up writing a story about the fact that a hailstone fell in a little town in South Dakota that set the state record for the biggest hailstone. Which I thought, well, that's not really been very important, but it was quirky and kind of interesting. And I get the sense from some reporters that there's a tendency to want to find an oddball theme or storyline.
I think there are, you mean it uniquely in the Midwest? Like, look at those weirdos kind of thing? Interesting.
Weird stories out in Florida.
Okay. I think there are moments where editors are looking for features where somebody sees something and goes, that's really fun. We want to do something fun. I can't think of the last time I did a fun story or a story about a hailstone. But I mean, I don't know that I do think that we do more substantive things than that. And I think there are times where you have to look at mix of the paper and look for something fun. I'm not sure the Midwest gets any more. I remember when I think we had a story about how it had rained in LA for the first time in 10 years or something, and that was a front page story. And I thought, gosh, it rains all the, like that's.
Well,
so, I mean, we all have our moments.
Well, and
you know?
there's also the Twitter account Florida Man that aggregates all the stories of just, Florida man found,
right.
Doing something weird.
Can I real quick?
Please,
So
please.
John, I know I had a story that might, I don't know if it falls into your category or not. I mean, not going to go to my home state of Ohio and try to find something, something that is because it's so weird, it's worth covering. I don't think that that's necessarily interesting, but the last story I did that was kind of like that in Ohio was I did a story on the death of the square-toed place kicker. You remember, like, the guys who kicked the ball straight ahead instead of soccer style? And it just so happened that it still lives in Ohio, of all places. That's where the most square-toed kicking shoes are sold. And that goes back to, into some of these communities where the communities still have a cohesiveness and a smallness, and the dad kind of passes on this this skill to his son, and then he still uses this square-toed kick because you have to have the lineman still has to kick, and there's a number of aspects of that is I don't endearing isn't the right word, but intriguing and based in sort of this Midwest mentality, and it's a quirky story, but it's not like a hey, look at that rube quirky story. It's like, hey, I can see that happening in rural Ohio, and this is, I mean, it's an interesting story where you're able to take something like that, but give it a depth that goes beyond, some guy is getting hit in the head with a hailstone or something, right?
Okay, so.
Well, I guess talking to people on the ground, talking to African Americans on the ground, I don't know if I ever had a conversation where someone said directly like it's because of this change, a change in national politics, or because of the president taking, having a black president is what allowed for this to happen, or made people more aware. But I think in retrospect, people, African Americans, are more cognizant of the role that a black president, black attorney general play, and the ground for what happened in Ferguson, I think, had been laid over such a long period of time. You could argue hundreds of years, and because Ferguson was at this overlapping spot of a number in a Venn diagram with a lot of things. You have the ticketing, the policing, the lack of representation of the community. 53 police officers on the force, 3 were black. They had only had 2 black city council members in the history of the city.
The population was 2/3 black.
And the population of 21,000 is two-thirds black. I think that a lot of these, a lot of that was set. Maybe, I never had someone tell me, yeah, it was the election of President Obama that made me think of this, but it did create conversations in retrospect, and those conversations are happening all over the place now, with conversations of what it means to have a black president who, comes from the Midwest.
Well, there. Oh, sorry.
So I think that there's a frustration too, but I think maybe 20 or 30 years from now, when people look back on the Obama presidency and Ferguson, I think maybe at that point, I think maybe there'll be a retrospect. That's especially that I think people will think about these issues, the kind of climate.
Yes, please.
That's a really good question and really complicated one. I think our industry has completely changed in the last 5-10 years. And that's just, it doesn't matter what kind of newspaper you're at or news organization you're at. It has, you guys will not disagree with me about this. It's just change is what's happening to us. I'm sure you all understand that we're trying to understand how to be part of the digital world in a way that we can still survive, is essentially the thesis. And I think the ways that, so it's a little hard to put together which happened first and whether, for example, the demographic changes affect, what I know is that the changing in the industry for us has changed pretty much everything. So after that, it's sort of hard to line up which happened first, which happened next, and what was the cause and effect. What I know is that there's been very dramatic change for all of us in the news business. And I do think that the regional newspapers all over the country have suffered especially, I would say. And again, from watching it, you know, I love reading local papers everywhere I go. That's one of my favorite things to do first, is to stop and buy the local paper. And It's been hard to watch. I think that does affect then, someone has to fill that gap and cover things. I do feel more responsibility now to make sure to cover what needs to be covered because some of the regional papers can't be there in as much depth. They don't have as big State House coverage as they once did. So where we might have once gone in and done a feature for 2 weeks, we have to really be there also for the meat and potatoes to make sure that people know what was happening because they may not be able to depend on the local paper in the same way. There's some very strong local papers still, and let's hope they remain that way. I don't know if I'm answering your question really.
Yeah. So is that, do you guys have similar thoughts on that or anything to add?
Well, certainly it's shifted for us. We used to have far more bureaus than we do now. And so at the same time, though, there's sort of a paradox going on right now in that the Chicago Tribune just bought a large chain of suburban newspapers, and they really see that is an increasing area of focus for them. They recognize that there is a real hunger for very local news, specific to very local communities. So hopefully maybe we're going to swing back in the other direction, but definitely we've all been shrinking somewhat in what we've been able to cover.
I mean, just, what's happening in Baltimore right now, there was just a lot of talk about how a lot of people are turning to local news outlets to get their news on Baltimore because it's people who actually have the local beat, and if somebody comes to Chicago and wants to know what's going on in Chicago, they're going to pick up the Trib or Sun-Times first, and when I'm in Minneapolis, I pick up the Star Tribune, like the local papers. And I don't know if it's because, the whole like demographic hollowing out, I don't know if it's as much that as the pressures of consolidation and making money with other newspapers and the ability to buy up smaller newspapers. But there is, as Monica said, there is a strong local presence in a lot of places still. And let's hope that the way things are going right now, it will continue this way, and there will be a strength that will be able to be maintained by local newspapers and good local TV, which is important.
Yeah, to clarify, the Tribune, the bureaus that have closed for the Tribune to some extent or have been consolidated have been the national and world bureaus. So to some extent, we've focused more energy on local coverage.
So particularly Ben and Monica, building off that, I wonder if you could walk us through kind of your assignment process, because when you think about it, there is possibly a difference in expectations. Nobody's ever gonna, you guys aren't gonna write a story about the Grand Rapids City Commission. You're probably not even gonna write about a third-tier Michigan political issue if there's a giant political issue in Minnesota that's bubbling over. So how do you guys prioritize which Midwest stories you're covering? Because your beat is really this big geographic, your beat is a concept, really. So how does that happen?
This is the hardest part of the work, I think. So, like I said, there's always too many stories. There are all the stories you really, really want to do that are sort of big enterprise stories that you have been thinking about and conceptualizing and seeing patterns as you do your coverage and that you really want to dig into. And then there are things happen every day. Things happen every single day. And some of them really matter. Some of them don't. Trying to figure out which ones do, which ones don't. That's the hardest choice of all. And sometimes we make, not the right decisions. So I think part of it is looking for, what I try to look for to see what's going to rise. And I would disagree with you that I'm always disagreeing with you. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
That someday I hope I will come and cover a Grand Rapids City Council meeting, because there are issues that come out of any political environment or city or anywhere that turn out to be somehow emblematic of something else. So what I try to look for are either stories that are just on their face, too important, too meaningful, just too gripping to not do, and that you can just tell what those are. You know, those are the ones that you keep reading, and you keep going back to check the website to see, do they have something more on that? If you're intrigued by it, it's probably a really good story. The second set of stories I look for are ones that say something about the Midwest. If I think there's a story, hopefully not about a hailstone, but maybe, that somehow says something more about the region or says something that will help people understand the Midwest a little bit better, then I aim for that one. If there's something that shows a national trend that is happening and is playing out here, then I try to go for that one. And it's a constant juggling act, and there are always too many stories that could be good, and it's a matter of making that daily decision. Do we put this aside to go for that? Do we stand by it and hope that we can get away with not worrying about that for a few minutes? That's probably the hardest part of the job, is that decision.
Sure. And is that decision, and I'll ask you the same thing, is that decision entirely autonomous on your part?
No,
Is it in?
No. It's collaborative. So my editors in New York have their ideas. I work for a national editor and a deputy national editor in New York, and we talk nonstop. I mean, nonstop on email every time I see a story come by that I think has some real potential. I get clips from 11 states every morning at 8 in the morning and start reading them from each state. And when I see something that I think has potential, I reach out to my editor and start talking about it, or one of my colleagues and start talking about it. And so we usually reach some sort of consensus. I mean, some of them aren't big decisions. They're obvious that you need to run quickly and jump on a plane. Others are more complicated or subtle decisions. Do you need to cover spot news, or can you build this into something that'll be deeper and more meaningful by next weekend, that will say a lot more and show a pattern in the Midwest, or will show a national trend in some way, or just will be a better story for having deeper, richer reporting? Those are all decisions that we go back and forth on.
So how does it work for you?
Well, about a month ago, I covered a city council far smaller than Grand Rapids. I think I covered Ferguson City Council meeting, and I mean, there are times when city council is the place to cover, and I think that with a lot of, I mean, if you look at a city council, right, just talking about what happened in Grand Rapids City Council, for a national readership, it may not be that gripping unless what's happening here is showing us something else that's happening throughout the region, which is also influencing what's going on nationwide, right? I mean, to go back to John's hailstone, right? Like, the largest hailstone in South Dakota, well, what if that is indicative of climate change across the U.S. and there are larger hailstones over here, and California has no hailstones,
Right,
you know?
Right, sure.
And to me, like,
Order dreaming here.
yeah, right. But I mean, you know, to tell the story of a particular city council or a particular hailstone is, at the end of the day, is not that compelling. It's more gee whiz. But if you use that as the jumping off point for a larger story, that's just a better storytelling, and also ultimately gives more depth to not only the national issue but the local issue. I mean, I remember going to Osceola, Iowa to cover a pie sale for candidate Joni Ernst. And there was something about that event in Osceola, Iowa that told a bigger story about what was happening in that race in Iowa, a bigger story about what was happening in the Midwest with political trends, and also what ultimately would affect the capital and the national political picture. And I mean, I think that's a key part of any good story, is finding that one anecdote that can tell.
Right. Okay.
I actually have a question for Ben, which I'm curious. I had no idea you have a divinity degree and you were in the military. So how in the world did you end up switching to journalism, and how does the divinity school and the military inform your reporting?
Right.
Does journalism really pay better than
It pays better than being a minister, I think, but not much. That's that's interesting, and I think that affects that helps affect the way I cover Midwestern stories in a lot of ways. I mean, when like I said, I just got back from Minneapolis and the Somali community and talking about some of those pressures with extremism, and that can at times affect that community, and it's great to be able to go into a place and discuss that, or if you go into a town and there's you want to talk to the local whatever minister, whether it's like AME minister or knowing the difference between American Baptists and Southern Baptists, and being able to have that conversation unlocks a lot of doors, I think, for me, and allows for me to get a better understanding of things. And then also just having a military background, it helps with it can help disarm that idea, like you said, like, oh, you're from the Times. When did you get here? When are you leaving? Like how much time are you going to spend with us? But when you come in and you say, oh, hey, nice Marine Corps hat. What, how long were you in? 5 years? I was in 6.5. Good to meet you, And it's like, it helps disarm people, and also gives a better, a more well-rounded picture for, I think a lot of journalists don't have that demographic background.
What made you choose journalism after that?
The GI Bill was a great thing, but and part of it was I was stationed in the Middle East for a while. I did embassy security, and I was based in Abu Dhabi. And when I was there, I was reading a lot of news sources and watching a lot of news that I didn't see when I was here. Like I got exposure to Al Jazeera English when it was, I don't think AJ America was around yet, and reading local English language newspapers made me realize that there's all these other perspectives that weren't necessarily being told on in American media. And I think that's true of, to sort of bring it back to the Midwest, it's sort of true with that as well. Like if you're reading, if you're part of a place that you don't think is being covered enough, or you think is being covered improperly, or it's all hailstones, it's like there's, that can helps inform that. But that's kind of how I came around to it.
Interesting.
I'm kind of curious for each of you, did you feel growing up where you grew up that the Midwest was covered appropriately? Did you feel like it needed to change?
So, when I was growing up, I grew up in Chicago and read what was then 9 newspapers. It was a lot more than the Tribune and the Sun-Times. And I grew up reading newspapers, and I thought it was great. I mean, I thought they were great. There was so much competition back then. It really was something like 9 newspapers, and we got them all at our house. So actually, I was somewhat oblivious to national reporting, and was really focused. I mean, the local reporting in Chicago was fantastic. It's a great newspaper town. It was a great newspaper town. It still is.
Yeah. What about you in Dayton?
So I was born in Dayton. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, and I paid attention to the local newspaper, and wanted to be a photojournalist. So I've shot freelance for them at the end of my high school, when I was in high school, and I just paid attention to the local paper. But I was also sort of as a good teenager, oblivious to news that was happening, and just sort of paid attention to the local paper. But I didn't have that depth of I guess depth of knowledge to be able to say, oh, this is being covered well or not well, or which I don't know if you had. Were you a newspaper nerd when you were a kid?
Yeah, and I was in Detroit, where it was still a strong 2 newspaper town, so there was lots of competition there.
Okay, in front here.
One part, have there ever been stories, especially for Monica and Ben, that you've thought have been important about the Midwest that you have not been able to sell to your editors in New York? But the flip side of that is kind of, and all 3 of you really, is there any kind of Midwest story that you think is really important given world enough and time that you'd really like to write, to offer to the rest of the world? It might get you farther from airports than you usually get as Dr. What might
Well, so for competitive reasons, I'm sure not going to throw out my story ideas. It's a wonderful question, but yes, do I have like big dreams of huge enterprise that would involve months of reporting on the ground somewhere? Yes, I do. But like I said, with the Wall Street Journal in the room and the Chicago Tribune in the room, I don't really want to share that. I would tell you that there are lots of stories that I've wanted to do that I didn't do in the end, for one reason or another, usually because something happened. Something else happened and trumped whatever the story I was working on was. I don't think I've ever had an editor say, no. They might say, is that as good as this? Or they might say, what if we look at it through a different lens? What if we think about it a different way? But I'm not sure they've ever just on their face said, no, I mean, it's not like I've never been turned down for a story pitch, but not on something that really was a good story, no.
I mean, that sort of comes with professional practice too. I think when I first graduated college, yes, I would get stories turned down,
ideas,
but eventually you figure out what flies, I think.
I think that's absolutely right. Is that better than this? And that's what ultimately comes down to, because time, your time is finite with what you can cover, and is this story, which is good, better than this story, which might be better? And I think that there are times when you get frustrated that you want to do something, but there are also times when if you 3 months go by and you realize, boy, if I would have written that, that would have been dumb. Like it wasn't as big of a deal as I thought, and because of the collaborative process with editors and folks who are like making sure that the forest is paid attention to rather than the tree. But yeah, I think there's never a time to be like, oh, that's just something happening in Wisconsin. That's not a big deal. I think that that's never happened. Plus, there are times when there are some of these stories that, yeah, I'm going to focus on this and write some stuff, and then it suddenly becomes a national issue, or something happens to like flip it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I cover the VA and was paying attention to a lot of VA issues in last April, and then Phoenix happens, and then suddenly, it's like, I think that also happens with the way, all of our coverage is you're keeping an eye on something, and then suddenly the metric on that scale of is this better than this switches because of the national import.
Yeah.
I've been thinking that in relation to John's question about is one person enough to cover 7 states, that a comparative perspective might help us self-pity Midwesterners. So I'm just curious how many people the New York Times has covering, say, the South or the Southwest.
Well,
or
just to
Northwest, or the whole continent of Africa, maybe.
Just to clarify, I mean, John, I know who you heard that from, and that was sort of kind of true, but it was never really, when something happens, we send everybody. Like people can fly from New York, they can fly. I mean, when Ferguson happened, we had a team in November when we were there. We had more than 10 people there on the ground every day. So, and that's bigger than our bureau is. So it's not like we are going to skip it or something. If Joplin happens, we'll be there, and we send in people. But the other thing is, it's not really true that one person in Kansas City covered all of the Plains states, all 7 of those states. We have, not to be too defensive of our bureau, but we have a Kansas City bureau and 3 people in Chicago, plus a video journalist who cover the 11 states. So we divvy things up as needed. I think in that moment, we had split things up in a way that would imply that he was all alone covering those Plains states. But as it is now, what we do is this set of, how many people did I just say? 5 people, if you include the video journalist, who is excellent. We look and sort of triage the 11 states as needed. So in other words, if we needed 5 people to be in Nebraska, we could be, or more. So it's not really accurate to say that we have one person covering the Plains states. We don't do that.
I think a comparative perspective,
Yeah.
people actually decide to be responsible for a region or a continent.
Right.
How would it compare?
How do they compare to what?
You have, I mean, how many?
Oh, compared to the South.
South
We're actually doing great right now. I mean, to have 5 of us out here in the Midwest compared to the South, I think they have 3 now, although again, I'm estimating. And their southern states, they also have, I think, 12 states. So this is the division of labor. The Mid-Atlantic, where Baltimore is, we have 1 person who covers the Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, that little cluster of states. We split it up a little differently, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, but not too far differently. So actually, no, you guys are covered.
How about the continent of Africa?
Well, we have a bunch of people there. We did a giant series on Ebola last year that actually just won a Pulitzer Prize just earlier in April. And so, but again, we have several bureau chiefs in Africa, but we sent in people as needed, like science writers and so forth, to handle the Ebola situation. So I do not think that the Midwest is getting short shrift. In terms of New York Times reporters, that's not to say that we cover every story everyone would want, and it's also not to say that every paper feels fully staffed. They've got more, the Wall Street Journal has more folks out here.
We do, but we also cover, I mean, of course, there's never enough people, and there's never enough coverage for anything. You always want more. But at the same, if however many people you have, if you just have a handful of people in the Midwest, there's also the DC reporters who are coming out for political stories, who are covering things.
Right.
I mean, for us, if there is if there's an issue with fracking, say, well,
An energy reporter comes.
Right. We have a whole team of energy reporters who are keeping an eye on that. And if you have
A political team comes out to cover Iowa.
Right.
It's not as though, you always want more, but I don't know that there's a shortage.
And there's
of
special
people.
reporters who are senior writers who are coming out and doing special stories on X, Y, and Z. And I mean, there are never enough, right? But there are, to say that there's only 3 people or whatever covering the Midwest is a bit of a misnomer, because you have the entire institution that can come in.
Well, and in some ways, it's almost that shows some of the difficulty of how do you divide up all the news in the world, and one way to do it is divide it up geographically, but you could also divide it up topically.
Well, that's another, and actually we divide it both ways. So for example, we have a labor writer as well, but I also cover some labor issues. So there are times when we have a legal affairs writer, and again, they cover the entire country if there is an important legal issue, but that also sometimes is something that we see as on our turf. Same with policing, same with most issues. There is a beat writer in New York who focuses just on that topic. So there's a lot of different ways to slice this, and usually it works out. And the truth is that oftentimes there are more people clamoring to do a story rather than the opposite. In other words, there might be people actually vying to cover a certain story or having a piece of a story rather than the opposite.
This may be kind of a backhanded compliment, but in terms of assignments, the New Yorker, pick on somebody else.
Thank you.
Ran a piece about politics in Indiana, where I'm from, which those of us reading it said they got it all wrong. They got the dispute between the governor and the superintendent of public instruction all wrong. But a few weeks ago, I pick up the New York Times, and
I thought you were picking on someone else. No, I'm kidding.
I pick up the newspaper, The Rise, and I see Indiana has made the front page, below the fold. And my heart sinks. I think this is not good when we make the New York Times, because you guys only, the big newspapers or the New Yorker or whatever, the national outlets only pay attention when we're doing something stupid, crazy, whatever. And we were. But the story was out of Martinsville. And being from Indiana, Martinsville has a certain reputation. So I'm wondering about the nuances of that. Do you in Chicago, know that
Okay, so,
What's a good place to go?
look,
I'll just add, it was actually a very nice story.
what's it? Yeah. I thought it was a really, I know exactly which story you're talking about, and that was actually a colleague who covers the South who was brought in to write that story. It was interviewing people about how they felt about how this crisis over the Religious Freedom Bill had affected people in Indiana and their identity and how they were feeling about that, how they felt the reputation of the state was doing. I thought he did a lovely job on that story. I thought it was sensitively done. Look, we can't be from everywhere. So I think I know that I'm very sensitive to it because I know whenever I read a story that's about my neighborhood, there are a few things that don't sound quite right. It bothers me especially. I can hear when it's slightly off because you know the nuances of Indiana probably better than anyone else in this room, I'm guessing. Or it may be that community in Indiana, maybe you know that better. So can we be perfect experts on every single community? No, but we try, and we try to reach out to people who are in order to make sure we understand the connotations of those things. I think also you should know that on that particular story, that was a voices story, so it was talking to people in the community, trying to go to a more rural community, not just in the center of Indianapolis, where we had already written a number of stories about the Religious Freedom Bill and the debate from Indianapolis. I know because I was the one writing them in Indianapolis. And so he came in to go and talk to people who might not be right in the most metropolitan area, who were not marching around the Capitol building, who were just out there in the state. I don't know why he picked that particular town. What did you think about the story in the end?
Oh, actually, I thought it was a great, I picked it up with foreboding. And when I talked to my son on the phone, I said, Indiana made the front page of the New York Times. And he said, oh no. What is, and then he said, oh, it's the Religious Freedom.
Yeah.
Right. But I thought it really was a very sensitive, you should tell your colleagues.
I will.
I thought it really captured what people in Indiana were feeling and saying about that piece of legislation.
The one thing I would say about that too is that, again, if you look back, not that you should spend every day reading every paper, but the truth is that we wrote at length about that issue for several days in a row and coming at it from different points of view. And it's important to look at the whole body of work, not just necessarily one day. That wasn't the only day we were there. We were actually there for many days. And it's worth looking to see, putting the pieces together. I'd be curious what you think about the other days too. Again, sometimes you take a glimpse at the paper and you think, well, this is what they're writing about Indiana. But actually we wrote a lot more too. And it should be a whole picture, I think.
Well, I guess I take this back to what Jennifer said. If I understood you correctly at the beginning, about how the Midwest should chart its own way and not worry about what big outlets, newspapers, coasts think of us. But I think we feel that's hard to do when the times when we appear on the national scene are Ferguson to the Religious Freedom Act, things that are not the prettiest part of our lives.
Oh,
Real
please,
quick,
yeah.
I think that if I'm going into a place that I'm relatively unfamiliar with, I'm not going to just, and I don't think I would like to think that none of my colleagues would either, just pull a quote from the first woman I find on the corner or the first guy I find in a bar and use that. I'm going to
The taxi cab driver.
Yeah, right. I'm going to make sure that I understand how does, if Osceola, Iowa, I'm going to understand how Osceola, Iowa fits into the bigger picture before I'm going to mention that or use that as some sort of an example or touchstone.
Right, it's hard, right? But we try. I think the other thing to remember is that that's the most fun part of what we do, is going to a town that we don't know, trying to explore it, and really getting a chance to talk to people and try to understand the community a little bit. So while it's not always done perfectly, that's actually part of the beauty of the job, is you get to come into a brand new place and try to sort of figure it out by talking to various people and getting a real sense, rather than running in, getting a few quotes and running out. Those are the really bad days when you find yourself doing that.
And one of the things that I do when I talk to people who may be reticent, if I go to go to a town that I've not been to before in Indiana or something, I will hand a person my card if they're reticent to talk, and I would say, I want you to go to the website, go to our website, look up what I've written in the past, pick any, look through the stories, and see the way I handle the topic. And I don't, the last thing I would want is for somebody to be able to pull up a story and say, oh, look, it's just it's like one-sided rubery or something, it doesn't benefit. I mean, from just like a big picture, it doesn't benefit our collective knowledge to do something like that, and it's bad for at the very lowest level, it's bad business for us as reporters, because it's going to come out that you grab the first quote you found or something, and I want to do we want to do our best to understand that particular place and to tell a well-rounded story.
And I think it's also important to think too that news doesn't usually focus on, often doesn't focus on the happy things. I mean, the stories that newspapers want to tell are more of the difficult things to explore, why things are the way they are, and how we might evolve out of that or change from that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a long-standing sort of existential question of the field of journalism, is the centrality of conflict to the idea of newsworthiness, and so I think that goes beyond the Midwest.
I would, that's really true. I think that question of does there have to be a conflict for it to be a story, one thing to think about is that people complain if you write about conflict, and then they complain if you write about something trivial and quirky.
Right.
So
right,
I just
right.
would point out
Yeah.
that,
It's best when they
it's
complain
kind
about
of
both,
hard
probably.
to,
That's the thing. I love that, seeing in comment sections like, oh, this was the most important story you could have written. The Golden Globes is it's particularly like with awards shows. It's like, there are people starving in Africa, and you're writing about this awards show. And it's like, well, you can do both, I think. There's a very patient person with a question over there.
I want to go back to just in passing, Brian mentioned the industrial east, the agricultural west. I'm not sure you did directions, but you're kind of pointing in the right direction of the Midwest. And this always conjures up images to me of factory, farm, and then Rust Belt, meaning that the factories aren't working anymore, and then empty heartland, which means there are no farms anymore. And I'm wondering if how much time you devote to what's actually going on in terms of the economic renaissance for the Midwest, which is in the service sector. And it's happening, Grand Rapids is a model. That's a city I know well. I live here. I live in the Twin Cities, and that's been that way for a long, long time. That there's education, there's the medical industry, and there's also the arts. And a lot of this hangs together. That we know the old saw that creative people attract creative people. So there's, I'm just wondering how much you pay attention to this, and maybe I just haven't read the Times closely enough to see that's been reported. But it seems to me that it's a huge story, and it's important for the Midwest, because the Midwest is farm and factory. No, not anymore. They're not even standing. They've been cleared away. But maybe they've been cleared away for building new colleges. And I talked to this gentleman here, which is a lot smaller than Grand Rapids, and it's happening down here, which really surprised me. It's, what was it, for 50,000 or so? 80,000. Yeah, so I'd like to hear your comments on that.
I think that is exactly the way, in a perfect world, I like to see the clips in the morning, is to see it through like that, not just that lens. I mean, there are a bunch of different lenses to look through, but the economic lens is huge. So if you can tell a story, if I see a story that somehow reflects that, yes, what's the future of, and I would point you to some stories, but of course I can't think of them right at the moment. The farm question especially, I feel like we have shown that. But in the coverage, when you're picking your stories, that's the kind of thing that actually we are looking to write. You might be writing about a specific thing, but it should have that broader, how is the region moving that way, both post-2008 recession, but also stepping way back in a bigger way. I agree with you that those are two really crucial changes that are happening, and the key somehow is to, yes, cover daily news, but to be looking for the story that will reflect that trend and explain it and sort of say where the Midwest is going. When you know, those are the kinds of like holy grail stories that's my ideal. It's not always through an economic lens, but that's a perfect example of I kind of like to think of there being a few themes that you want to stick to. I think the economy and sort of where the Midwestern economy is going is one of them. Where when I see something that reflects on that, I'm much more interested than other things. If it's something about labor, I'm much more interested in that than some other things. When you're looking at, again, the political changes in the states, I'm much more interested in that because I feel like you almost, because there is so much to pick from, you have to pick some things that will give a broader perspective on something really important, like how the economy is changing. I think we've probably done a better job at that on the farm issue and sort of the shrinking, the disappearance of the family farm, the selling to larger companies, the disappearance of farms altogether, looking at those issues, I think we've probably done a better job. I would say I've done a better job than I have at looking at sort of the industrial question that you raised that I think is also a really good one. But stories that reflect on those two issues I think are really essential. Mm-hmm. Right.
And people are writing because it takes 45 minutes to do that. Well, you can drive even in rush hour. You can probably do it in an hour. It's not rush hour. But the point is that light rail line was not so much for strictly transportation per se, but in building communities. It's been the base for restoring lots of communities within the cities that have gone down. So that's a much broader.
That is, and actually what you just said explains part of the problem of our jobs, I think, is that I've read a million of these clips about the light rail thing there. I mean, I've read them and it's not something that's jumped out at me because nobody expressed it that way. If you can explain to me if you can write a story that says what you just said, so thanks for the story idea. No, seriously, so you can see a million clips fly by from the local media about this light rail issue, and it just feels like in the weeds of transportation in a city that doesn't have a bigger meaning. Well, that's a much bigger meaning. So that's exactly, you just conceived a story right there. Thank you.
It's funny because I want to loop this back to something that somebody else had a question about, and that is, whether part of this disconnect of perception has to do with the real troubles on the local level with reporting, and I'm fascinated to hear the role that clips play. So do you have the same kind of process where you get clips in the morning?
I'd say we have probably a lot of the same sorts of things.
Well, I love hearing that because there's a thing in the academic literature about journalism that talks about the New York Times effect, and it's this very well documented kind of thing that if the New York Times writes about something on day one, on day two, everybody else is going to write about it. But it also works in the other direction, and if there's troubles with local reporting, that actually has an effect for you all, because if stories aren't getting covered on the local level, they might not make it onto the national level.
On the other hand, there's a whole new resource for that. So the truth is, Twitter and social media, Facebook and everything else, things bubble up in a way that they never did. To the point where, I think it's really, really helpful and useful. And so there's a whole new stream of information coming at us where you can find stories.
And also with clips I was trying to think of some examples of ways that I might have done something that addresses, your question. I wrote a story last year, I think, about, and I got this, saw a clip from the Phoenix Symphony Orchestra who were coming back, and I said, well, that's interesting, it's happening in Phoenix. I wonder if it's happening elsewhere. So I contacted these symphony orchestras in a number of Midwest towns, and then told the story of the revitalization of local orchestras and new funding and new ways of performing and getting the word out that told the story of economic revival kind of across the board. Did another story about a return to profitability in the horse auction in Lexington, Kentucky, and that told about greater profitability or like bounce back of the economy. So we do frame these things. We also have, for the journal, we have a very robust business and technology section, the B section, which covers a lot of these things. Like looking at, if you're talking about sort of tech and intellectual growth in the Midwest, you have the Google high-speed internet hubs, and we covered that. There's a number of things that do get covered, maybe more from a business perspective, rather than the U.S. News sort of A section of the paper. The B section also has a number of things, and I think that's important to recognize.
Oh boy, we wanted that Google high-speed hub in Grand Rapids bad.
Is that right?
We put a full court press forth on that. Yeah, please.
I'd like to ask a question. I'd like you to give us something juicy, because you've been talking about methodology, which is great. And I'll turn the tables on you, like the press always does, and say, play the game that you have an extra person that's coming up with your own perhaps maybe they're not from the Midwest. What are you going to tell them about doing that job? For example, Monica, Chicago politics. What's the idiot's guide to Chicago politics? Or then somebody's going out to the Iowa caucuses or Iowa. What are you going to tell them? How do you get in there and know what's going on? I know you want to answer it by saying ask good questions and methodology, but if you give people something about perceptions of the region, because that's what we.
Oh, you mean, do we give them like everybody here is blah, blah, blah? Yeah. Not to be like Pollyanna here, but I do, with each story, I do talk to my colleagues about stories that they're pursuing, and I give some names and phone numbers and some ideas, but I'm not sure. I think it really takes years to build up an understanding of what's going on, and things change all the time, and I don't know. I'm not sure there is an idiot's guide to any of these things. What do you think?
I think that you're rarely going to go someplace complete without having any idea of what's going on. Like if I'm covering, going to cover something with Wisconsin, with the Wisconsin labor debate. Well, I'm already know something about that. That's why I'm in the Midwest as a Midwest U.S. News reporter, because I'm kind of keeping up on that sort of thing. I think it's very rarely I'm going to get a call to go parachute into Timbuktu or something and cover a story without having done some background on that and having some idea. And yeah, I don't think there is an idiot's guide besides, hey, I know that, oh yeah, Monica's in Chicago, give her a call, she might know about this, and then you sort of pre-report, so.
Here's a couple phone numbers, probably.
Yeah, right.
I actually, the funny thing of it is, I have an anecdote from my newspaper career that sort of speaks to that. There was a case some years back where the city of Holland had a local vote whether to put internet filters on at the local district library, and it was. So this is 1999. It was pretty early in this early days in this whole wide internet adoption thing, and so I had been covering the story for a couple months, And then at a certain point, it turned national. So every day, I would get a call from some national outlet, and somebody would ask me for some phone numbers, and I would usually give them, okay, so here's basically what's happening, and kind of a real talk thing. And once I didn't realize that the reporter, it was a reporter from Yahoo, was actually interviewing me, and which was sort of a violation of my paper's standards. It was like a fireable offense, and fortunately nobody saw that story. I spent the next week, but reporters really do mostly help each other out, in non-competitive ways.
I think, I do think that it's funny you'd say it hadn't dawned on you you were being interviewed. It does seem like the environment has changed somewhat. I think it used to be more that, of course, if somebody came in, certainly from the New York Times or just a friend from some other paper or something, you share phone numbers and that sort of thing. I do find now that I make sure that we're not on the record.
Right, yeah.
Because everything is tweeted out, everything is out there now. Everything is, all sorts of boring pieces of information are shared with other people in a way that it just wasn't, you just didn't do before. But yeah, I mean, I will confess that I will tell people, this person's going to return your calls, this person isn't. Like, I'll give them that kind of lay of the land, but I'm not sure there's a general,
Yeah. So, in the red, yeah.
The young woman from Chicago, do you review books essentially with the idea that they're from the Midwest, or is that not a consideration?
Right. So when we choose which books to review, since we are based in Chicago and the Chicago Tribune, we certainly give an edge to books that have a Midwest angle to them. We don't exclusively review Midwestern books or exclusively use reviewers from the Midwest, but obviously, since we're in sort of the unofficial capital of the Midwest, we feel an absolute commitment to reflecting what's going on here in our culture, definitely.
Did you review John Locke's book?
Yes, we did. We did.
how do you do?
Pretty well. Yeah.
Okay. Back there.
I'm interested in the question of audience. I get both the Star Tribune in Minneapolis and the New York Times.
Excellent, thank you.
What about the Journal?
No, she's doing just fine. Go right ahead.
A lot of what's in the Star Tribune these days is directly from the New York Times, so I've already read it in the New York Times. But I'm
Yikes.
interested to know who, in each of your cases, who's the audience you're writing for? Is it a regional audience? Is it a national audience? Or how do you conceive of your readers, and to whom do you feel responsible when you're
We're writing for you. As we appear on your doorstep every morning. No, I think we write for a national audience or an international audience. We don't write for. I've worked at local papers, and you are writing for. The only difference really being how much you have to step back and explain things. When you're writing for the local paper, everybody already knows what the issue is, and you can kind of do some shorthand that you can't do when you're writing for a national or international audience. That's I think what we feel like we're doing. We step way back in a way that make the local reporters laugh sometimes, that we have to explain the most basic, obvious things. But sometimes the local reporter should do more of that. People forget about stepping back and saying what this was really about, because everyone is so in the weeds of a topic that they forget that not everybody remembers like the big themes. But I don't know. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, it's writing for a national or international audience, but in a way that a local will read the story and say, all right, yeah, that's a good point. Like Joe's Crab Shack is a good place to go to get an idea of what's going on there. Or, yeah, that does kind of amazingly explain in 2 paragraphs sort of the crux of the argument. It's never going to go as in-depth as the Star Tribune would maybe for a very, very local issue, but it's a national audience in a way that anyone locally would say, yeah, that's fair, and that's interesting, the way that have reframed it in a way that the Star Tribune might never have. Or
Yeah, we're more of a regional focus, so I think it's true that we try to offer context for people who are not right there, but we probably maybe don't step quite as far back as either of these two. I'm curious though, do you think that either of your newspapers have shifted focus at all in a way to sort of capitalize on the decline of local newspapers at all?
On editorial content,
to sort of cannibalize audiences that are maybe looking for a newspaper that they're now not.
I mean, we're
getting
all
served
looking
by?
for audience. I don't know. I mean, this is it's back to the question of demographics and so forth. There's such a giant change happening. It's hard to sort of take apart each piece of it.
Well, I'm thinking about that, just thinking with the Times, with the Texas partnership that is no longer happening, right?
That's right.
And what was that called again? I'm blanking. It was the Texas.
We had the same thing actually in Chicago. We had the
Chicago
news cooperative that the cooperative went away. It wasn't really something where we broke up before they went away. They just ended.
Right, but yeah, these are sort of deeper regional.
To do some local pages. We did it in San Francisco, in Texas, and in Chicago. And those all went away. And I'm not sure, again, I think that was more of a business. I'm not sure whether those operations worked, or I really don't know
Yeah.
actually what happened there.
So,
What do you think about, since you're talking about what's a story, what you pitch to your editors, what qualifies as important news, what do you think about a story about a populist rebellion among Midwestern intellectuals trying to reassert the identity of their... Is that a good story?
So how would you tell that story? I mean, in other words, you have to see action. So it can't just be a meeting, say, where people talk about doing something. You have to see signs that it's actually happening, right? Evidence of where's the rebellion? Show me some anecdotes that show that there is that happening, more than just people talking about it. That would be my own take on it. I mean, but if you show a reporter 3 examples of how that's really happening, that's a story.
Absolutely.
They formed an organization. They got up to 600 members in a few months. They got people here who are saying this is the best thing that's happened to them in a long time. It seems like it is. We're doing the same
Is this a story pitch?
Yeah.
Mississippi Valley organization did 100 years ago.
So I'd be curious to see what comes out of this meeting and then write the story that traces it back to this meeting as the foundation for all the great stuff that happened after it, right?
And I think we have time for one more question.
Yep. There was somebody in the back who had a. Yep.
Well, now it's kind of facetious because they take the New York Times on and basically say that if you're thinking about representing an audience, writing for you is also representing the audience back to that reader, right? And you guys blew it with Great Gate last Thanksgiving, right?
Wait, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
So, okay, last Thanksgiving, the New York Times printed every state's best Thanksgiving.
Oh, yeah.
The Minnesotans, man.
Yeah.
And Iowans, and for me, Ohio.
Don't even get me started.
But no, it gets back to where we started in this conversation, but it also gets back to this idea, if you're writing for your reader, you're also representing the reader to him or herself.
Yep.
And that's something that gets us back to root, right, and reading.
Yeah. Just so you know, our food operation is somewhat separate from our national operation. And they do a fine job, but
But it was totally about identities, right?
yeah,
You get to say what
I'm with you.
identity is what.
I mean, it's really hard to, in a way, I think that, I don't know if any of you saw this, but they did like the meal from each state, and it was really, what was the one from Minnesota? Grape salad, which apparently doesn't exist in Minnesota. I think that, did it not exist, or remind me of the rest of the story?
It only come from New York.
Well, it was somebody who had been like a transplant from Minnesota or some such thing. Anyway, I think that you have to make a distinction between, for me at least, you have to make a distinction between actual reporting and sort of they were doing images and a theme, and I think it was supposed to be fun. But I know exactly where you're coming from, and reporting should be reporting, whether it's about food or about labor or about violence or about anything else. So your point is well taken, and I agree. You just have to report it out. It's all in the reporting. You know, if you call enough people, you'll find out there is no grape salad.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Well, I think we are about done. I have had a ball up here with you guys. This has been a real treat for me. Absolutely.
And thank you very much, Brian, for joining us, and also Ben, Jennifer, and Monica for joining us out here in Grand Rapids. Let's give them one more hand. Thank you. We'll reconvene in about 15 minutes.